It's almost the end of the church year. So for Thanksgiving, our lectionary gives us these lovely end of the world texts. I actually thought it was ironic here on this Friday the 13th weekend, the opening of the movie 2012 about the end of the world supposedly predicted by the Mayan calendar, that we get this grim scripture from the end of Mark's gospel, what scholars like to call the little apocalypse of Jesus. I've been polling you all week, so I know some of you love these action-packed disaster movies, part of a genre my family likes to call Friday night films. We actually enjoy them at the end of a stressful week. You know, no subtitles, not too much thinking or realistic emoting. Things just blow up. This week for us, it was that classic from 1979, Alien. Remember that one? But I know others of you hate these violent special effects films. And as Sissy McKee pointed out with her wonderful slideshow at Serendippers last Tuesday, with all the negative news out there, with all the world is going through, it seems we're under attack from a million different directions, from global warming to terrorism, AIDS, famine, cancer, economic collapse, swine flu. With all of this coming at us 24/7 from the media, a spiritual practice of gratitude starts to make a whole lot of sense. Looking for what's right with the world is a great antidote to despair. That's the spirit behind Christian worship. Praise and prayer protects the soul from what is perhaps its greatest danger, fear. Don't we all in these scary times need more than ever to hear the message of the angels, the good news of Jesus? Do not be alarmed. The one who endures to the end will be saved. Our text for today begins with Jesus predicting the fall of the temple and the disciples taking Jesus aside on the Mount of Olives to explain himself. Today we forget how scary those words would have been. The fall of the temple has ceased to shock us. We've seen for most of our lives, that some 6-story high, impressive ruin of the Wailing Wall, all that's left of that temple. We never got to see the temple, though, in its full glory, with its white stones, gigantic stones shining bright in the sun on the top of Mount Moriah. Some of those stones that they found weigh 4,000 tons. It was huge. The whole thing covered, it was like a compound. It covered something like 12 football fields square of area, like 3 stadium links one direction and 4 stadium links the other. To get there, too, from the Mount of Olives, where the disciples were having this discussion, meant a hike down some 600 feet down into the Kidron Valley and then back up again. So you can imagine the view they'd have from the bottom of the ravine. It would have been like looking up a cliff some 60 stories high with then a 10 to 15 story high temple on top of that, with towers still higher on top of that. I remember the first time I stood on the plaza below the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. Maybe you do too. That's what Jesus and his disciples would have felt, these small town fishermen from Galilee. They couldn't help but be taken aback. And the temple, for them, was much more than a little meeting house, a place of worship. It was the tallest building in all Judea, and it was the national treasury run by men of great inherited privilege, education, money, and power. That's what Jen was talking about last week when she was sharing that story about Jesus and the poor widow. being cheated by some Bernie Madoffs of his time. Not really all that different when you think about it from the World Trade Center. So can we imagine a bearded religious zealot from nowhere standing there in a cheering mob predicting that those towers could be thrown down? Before it happened, I don't think most of us would have believed it was possible. Destruction on that scale implies an act of terrifying, horrific violence, much like the day of the Lord predicted by the prophet Daniel and quoted by Jesus. And the judgment day that Jewish apocalyptic literature said would come, that literature predicted it would begin right there at the foot of the temple, with the bodies of the dead piled high enough to fill the entire Kidron Valley. That was a chilling vision of their future. Do not be alarmed. Later in this text, later in Mark chapter 13, Jesus warns people to flee quickly, to not even go back into the house to get anything, to not even put on a coat. But do not be alarmed. How exactly did he think that was possible? Some of you I know remember what it was like on 9/11 to flee Manhattan, when nearly 3,000 people died at the towers. My dad had a cousin who could remember captaining his landing craft on D-Day, and not one single man under his command on that boat lived through that day. It is stunning to me what horrors some of you brave veterans have lived through and did not flee. But in times of war, civilians do suffer too, whether in Vietnam, as we learned during our in-between, or in Darfur, or today in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Normandy, I met a Frenchman, a cab driver who had been a teenager on D-Day, and he reminded me that while some 2,500 Allied soldiers died on June 6, 1944, between 15 and 20,000 French civilians, his friends and neighbors, also were killed in the invasion.